You're in for a treat. We are going to be talking tonight about the lighthouses along the eastern coast. This is Mr. J. Hyland. He is an author. He is a historian. He is a photographer. And he put this whole program together for you, and he founded what's called the Lighthouse Preservation Society. And they received the Presidential Achievement Award from the federal government for their effort to preserve lighthouse heritage. And some of the lighthouses are beautiful. I actually went to Newburyport and had dinner in one of them. It was very exciting, and it was very cool. It's the coolest thing my kids ever did for me. So we enjoyed that. So I'm sure you'll enjoy tonight. Thank you.
Marcia. Good evening, how are you?
Very good.
I'm wearing, since I'm going to be on television here, I decided to wear my keeper's hat. This is what they wore back in the old days, back in the 1930s and before, under the old U.S. Lighthouse service, before the Coast Guard took over the lighthouses. So it's a great history there. There's a story that goes back to around World War II of a Navy destroyer kind of searching for German U-boats off the coast of Maine on a dark and very foggy night. And as they were cruising the coastline, it appeared as though they were on a collision course with another boat. And they saw a light in the distance, and the captain told the signalman, said, get on the radio and tell them change your course 10 degrees to the north. And he did that, and a little while later, a message came back and said, change your course 10 degrees to the south. Well, the captain was getting a little concerned because, you know, it was pretty foggy, couldn't really tell about the distance because it was at night. And he said, he got on the radio himself, and he said, this is the captain speaking. Change your course 10 degrees to the north. The response that came back was, this is a seaman second class. Change your course 10 degrees to the south. Well, he was really upset by that time. And he got on the phone again and he said, this is a U.S. Navy destroyer. Change your course immediately 10 degrees to the north. The response that came back was, this is a U.S. Coast Guard lighthouse. Change your course 10 degrees to the south. So guess who moved? Well, lighthouses tend to get a lot of respect if you're out on the ocean, and they've been kind of a symbol of hope and for the sailors that have been out there, especially in the old days. They really did not have, in the old days, good charts of the ocean, and so they wanted to mark out where the difficult spots were and where the safe harbors were. And they did this with building lighthouses. It's actually considered to be the first great work of the American people. It's construction of lighthouses. It's the first Public Works Act, Ninth Act of Congress signed by George Washington. And so it goes way back, and the idea was to build enough lighthouses so that eventually that you would never be out of sight of a lighthouse, so you know where you were at. And of course, all the lighthouses had their own, eventually had their own kind of address, if you will. They all looked different, and they did that on purpose so that you wouldn't confuse them with the next lighthouse down the coast. But later on, when the electricity was started and such with these lighthouses, they started flashing signals that were timed. And even the foghorns were timed in certain sequences so that you could tell by timing the flashes or timing the sound of the foghorn exactly what the address was, and you could look it up on your chart and you know exactly what lighthouse you're looking at, even at night. So it really is an amazing subject. I've often said that lighthouses are to America what castles are to Europe. And there's a lot of folklore and legend, some great stories involving life-saving, pirate stories, romance stories of all kinds. And I'll touch on some of those as we see the slideshow here and get into it now. We'll have somebody dim the lights for us.
Do I put the microphone on and we have a little amp?
Yeah.
If it's too loud, let us know.
Is it late?
Dim the lights.
Okay.
How's that? Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is this on? I guess it is.
Yep, just no canoodling now.
Okay. All right, so this is a presentation of the Lighthouse Preservation Society. And I'm James Hyland. The first lighthouse that really kind of caught my attention, kind of got me started down the Lighthouse Trail, if you will, was the Strait Smith Island Lighthouse off of the coast of Rockport. And this is owned by the Audubon Society now. But back in the 70s, right after the blizzard of 78, actually, in that May following that winter, I took my kayak and having a background in photography at a film major in college at Purdue University, I decided to go out and photograph this lighthouse. And I was shocked to find that it was still active, and yet it was in deplorable condition. It was all rusted, the doors had been broken down, the walkway where those seagulls are seated had all collapsed, hadn't been painted in years, and yet it was still active. And, but I was really captured by the beauty of the location and decided to find out more information. I ended up going to the library down in Boston and started to do some research and realized there really hadn't been anything as of the 70s, you know, in recent years at that point, on lighthouses. Most of the work that had been done writing about lighthouses had been done in the previous century, in the 1800s, when so many of these were being built. But there, what I found out also was that the Coast Guard was going to be automating all these lighthouses, and they were slated by 1990 to remove all their keepers throughout the country. And so this was going to be a huge change for the history of lighthouses, and it kind of sent me into more research, and I ended up getting a grant and working, was put together by the National Trust for Historic Preservation with a new museum that was getting started in Hull, Massachusetts, called the Hull Life Saving Museum. And they were right across from the Boston Lighthouse, which is the oldest lighthouse in the country. And they wanted to do something about lighthouses in their new museum. So we agreed to work together, and they showed me how to write grants and such. I worked with their executive director. And the first thing that I got basically for a grant was a brand new motorhome on loan for me to travel around for about 2 years. From a manufacturer out in Kansas, of all places. And so that kind of sent me on the Lighthouse Trail. Before that actually started, though, I was starting to visit lighthouses, not just on the East Coast, but on the West Coast as well. I had a great aunt who had a ranch out in Oregon. She invited myself and my sister out that time back in the 80s. And we went along the coast and saw the Heceta Headlight, which is one of the most dramatic sites for a lighthouse in the entire country. It's just a niche in the side of a mountain overlooking this mountain. It's a gorgeous location on the Oregon coast. But the Hull Life Saving Museum I was working with is also the sponsor of the Flying Santa program, which was started by Edward Rowe Snow. Some of you may know that name, a great historian for New England. And the museum basically took over Edward Rowe Snow's job as the Flying Santa Claus, and they would, at Christmas time, go and visit all the, a number of the Coast Guard families at lighthouses and drop presents. So I was able to hitch a ride and see that whole program unfold and start doing some documentation for the museum exhibit that we hope to have in Hull. In the process of all of this, I also got a pass from the Coast Guard Admiral in the 1st District in Boston to actually get out to all the lighthouses and help document them before all the lighthouse keepers were taken out. So, and you know, everything was automated. This was off the coast of Maine. This is Matinicus Rock Light. I talked to a couple guys who had been doing construction out here during the winter times in February, and they were building a kind of a hut for some of the automation equipment. And they had finished up their work for the day, and the helicopter was going to come in. You see that square thing in the upper part of the island, that's the helicopter pad where they would land. But they were just kind of finishing up, and you know, some of these offshore lights, at least in the old days, they used to kind of, if they had trash and stuff, they just throw it into the ocean. So they had a couple scrap pieces of lumber and stuff. And they decided they were going to clean up and throw that out and over into the ocean. So just as they did that, a huge rogue wave came up and swept them off the rock in February into the water. Fortunately, they were wearing the Mustang life-saving outfits that the Coast Guard issues. And fortunately, the Coast Guard helicopter was approaching at that time and spotted them in the water and was able to pluck them out. But these offshore lights like this, I mean, this is like 20 miles offshore, very dangerous locations. And if you believe it, in the old days, families used to live at some of these sites. But later, as things progressed, they realized how dangerous it was. And so these stations tend to become stag stations where they just have usually a couple of young guys out there. But even at this particular station, just about 2 years before I arrived to take pictures here, one of the Coast Guardsmen had been out fishing in a boat and he was overturned and he drowned out there just fishing. So very dangerous locations at some of these offshore lights. And that's why the Coast Guard wanted to automate them, because it was a risk to their personnel, especially with these offshore lights. And almost half the lighthouses in New England are offshore. So here's another one. This is the Saddleback Ledge Lighthouse. And this lighthouse actually had a keeper's house attached to it, which they took down. But I read some accounts where the waves would actually top the roof. And so these people that were living in there were feared for their lives. And so it was this is Saddleback Ledge Light off the coast of Maine. Another very, very dangerous location for a lighthouse. After a while, the Coast Guard started to take down some of the keepers' houses as they started to abandon these sites. At this particular site, off the Maine coast, to Bush Island, it was during the Vietnam era, and they did practice explosives attack on this lighthouse, basically, and blew the keeper's house up as kind of a raid, if you will, kind of a practice drill. We lost a number of lighthouses around that time. Here's another one, Eagle Island lighthouse off the coast of Maine. Keeper's house destroyed again. But they did actually keep the old bell tower, which is the building to the left there. That would have kind of a cuckoo clock type of arrangement, in that they had large weights that are attached to chains, and they would crank it up, and as the weights fell, a big sledgehammer would come out the side of the structure on the left there. You can see there's a large piece of wood, of timber that held the fog bell, and would strike the bell on a regular basis, and then they'd have to unwound. They'd have to wind it up again. That's how those work, 4 foghorns. Here's another lighthouse off the Boston Harbor area, Deer Island. It's been a traditional lighthouse, but caisson type, but they replaced it with a fiberglass pole. And so not quite as beautiful. Up off the coast of Ipswich, there was a beautiful keeper's house there. They tore that down. At the tower itself, though, they actually moved to Edgartown by barge, and that's the Edgartown Lighthouse kind of Martha's Vineyard now. But this is all that remains in Ipswich of the light. They just built a skeletal tower up there. So it's similar to what they did on Great Captain's Island off the coast of Connecticut, the Greenwich area. The historic lighthouse was turned over to the town for upkeep, but the actual lit beacon was that skeletal structure off to the right there. So that was the working lighthouse, if you will. So I was seeing a lot of changes with these buildings. Here's another one, and I was seeing the loss of the heritage and the history of these buildings as well. You see this massive pipe, it looks like, that's in the front there? Well, that was a foghorn cannon. Goes way back, pre-Civil War, and that was just rotting away there. The house itself, this Egg Rock Light up off the coast of Maine. Of course, they decapitated the lens room at the top and put a tower, you know, basically a flagpole with a light bulb on top of it there. And what I found that they were doing is that they were putting aluminum siding and such over the historic woodwork. And it looked good from the outside, but when I got inside, there were like huge swaths of like paint and plaster just rolling off the ceilings and off the walls and such. And I realized after asking around, I said, what's going on here? These buildings are killing them. And they had no mission for historic preservation. And so they were just doing what they felt like they could. They were always considered to be, for many years, kind of the poor stepchild to the Pentagon. So they never really got the money that they wanted at that time. And they had no mission for historic preservation. Most of these weren't even on the National Register of Historic Places, I discovered. And almost all of them qualified. And they had no money, so, and no mission. And it was a difficult scene, I could tell, for these lighthouses. And I started becoming increasingly more concerned as I started documenting these buildings in the 1980s. This is a lighthouse that's down on Cape Cod. It's now privately owned. And of course, the tower, the lens room was taken down. Stage Harbor. It's a Dutch island near Newport. And the keeper's house, again, is missing. It was destroyed. I got inside this building, and it was probably the most disgusting building I've ever been in. The windows had been shot out by vandals. Rats and seagulls had been nesting inside. The guano and stuff was thick inside. There were plants growing on the floor. Another lighthouse just down the way from here, that's beneath the bridge there, going over to Jamestown. When they were doing bridge work several years ago, they hired a young guy to go over and clean up that lighthouse, and it was a similar kind of situation with a lot of bird dung and everything. And he breathed that stuff in for days, and he actually ended up going blind from it. And there was a big lawsuit at that time. So it's very dangerous too to clean some of these places up. And of course, there's asbestos problems and lead paint issues also for a number of these old lighthouses. Another issue that I found with the lighthouses, this is the Hyland light on Cape Cod, is the erosion issue, especially on the outer cape. And they were losing 4 to 6 feet off of these sandy cliffs each year. And so it was necessary to move this lighthouse back, and it cost us several $1 million. The Lighthouse Preservation Society, which I started, ended up contributing basically about a third. It was a $1.5 million moving project. We ended up getting the state of Massachusetts to pass a lighthouse grants program. And $500,000 went towards this project. It was matched by the federals for another $500,000, and then the local fundraising for the third piece for a total of $1.5 million to move that lighthouse. Another project that had to be moved was because of eroding cliffs was out on Rhode Island, on Block Island. This magnificent Victorian structure was moved as well. And that was moved primarily with funding that we got passed through Congress. It was what's called the Lighthouse Bicentennial Fund. My neighbor, I was living in Lanesville area of Gloucester during this time. My neighbor had been teaching at, had just retired from teaching at Harvard at the Kennedy School. And she was a young mother, she was a single mom, so she just kind of bowed out of her work. And I ended up talking to her about what I was seeing at these lighthouses. And she had actually grown up in Washington, D.C., and she was very bright. She taught at Harvard at the Kennedy School of Government. And her dad was actually with the Department of Transportation. And she said, you know, these buildings really belong to the American people. They don't really belong to the Coast Guard. And I think you ought to take your pictures and such and present them to someone on the Coast Guard Committee in Congress. So she lined things up down in Cape Cod, and I went down with her to see Garrett Studs at that point. He was on the Coast Guard Committee. And he said, yeah, I think this is a big issue. I want you to come down and share these pictures that you've been taking, and we'll have a congressional hearing on this. Wow. So here's another erosion problem at Sankaty Headlight on Nantucket. That building also had to be moved, and those houses were destroyed, but the tower they kept by moving it back. Anyhow, so I went down, and this lighthouse, this is Nantucket Great Point Light. This was wind erosion here. That whole point was shifting because of the wind. And eventually in a March storm, the waves came in and just toppled that building. And it was lost. It had probably the most beautiful spiral staircase I've ever seen built, you know, just around the early 1800s. Very ornate with a lot of scroll work. And it's a David Jones locker now. But anyhow, my neighbor and friend, Dr. Nelson, we ended up going to Congress. I mean, I had no idea what I was getting into when they asked me to participate in a congressional hearing. And when I got into the room, I was totally intimidated. It was packed with our nation's leaders and the press, and there was standing room only. I felt like I was on trial. And but I had all these pictures, and I went in with my neighbor. Well, she was, you know, she was in her 30s. She was a tall, blonde, Nordic type, and very attractive woman, and very verbal and very bright. And I said, you know something, I think you do a better job here with these old guys than I will. And she stepped up to it, and she did a great presentation. Of course, she heard all my issues and such that I discovered. And afterwards, the Coast Guard Admiral in charge of Eastern Navigation said, yeah, we're $7 million behind in deferred maintenance and no hope of ever catching up. And so the handwriting was on the wall, and the Congress at that point mandated that the Coast Guard relook at how they were doing their lighthouse policy, and it should start changing things so we weren't going to be losing all these lighthouses. What happened next was we ended up getting past the Lighthouse Bicentennial Fund, working with the National Park Service, and that money, that stipulated that lighthouses had to be on the National Register of Historic Places, and if they were, they could receive funding, a matching grants program issued through the National Park Service, and then distributed to the state historic preservation offices along the entire seaboard. Whoever had a lighthouse could apply. So that actually did a huge turnaround, and everybody started getting busy and nominating and researching their own local lighthouses and applying for funding to save them. And it was so popular, some of the lighthouses were, you know, the funding was matched many, many times over, and it saved over 160 lighthouse projects with funding and got them, all of America's lighthouses pretty much on the National Register of Historic Places. So that, it was so popular that we ended up getting the Presidential Achievement Award from Congress and from the federal government for that work. By the way, that's Cape Hatteras. That had to be moved as well. And we were on the my colleague, Dr. Valerie Nelson, and probably the foremost Lighthouse historian, National Parks historian, Ross Hyland, were on he was on our board as well. And they were asked by the Academy of Sciences to study the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse as to how it could be saved, because some people wanted it to stay where it was and to create riprap around it, kind of create an island around it. Others felt like it needed to be moved back because of the erosion. It ended up being moved. It was called the Move of the Century in 1999, and they moved it back about 200 yards by creating a nest of huge I-beams around it, jacking it up, and putting it on one of these tractors like they use at Cape Canaveral to move the spaceships. And it moves like, an hour or a mile in 10 days or something, and they were able to move it back that way and save that structure. But others, because of the neglect, like this screw pile type lighthouse near Newport News down in Virginia was totally collapsed. Those were interesting structures, look like this basically. This one was moved and saved at a maritime museum down in Maryland, the Cooper Strait Light. This lighthouse is a Race Point out on Cape Cod towards the end, and a lighthouse organization that came forward and restored this and has opened it up for overnight stays. And here's the Boston Light, the oldest of the lighthouses in America, built in early 1700s, and has a fascinating history. It was blown up by the British as they, retreated from Boston. They put a keg of gunpowder in there, blew it up and such. But it just has an amazing history, and it just, it is the oldest lighthouse in America. Here's another very old colonial light. This is the Sandy Hook Lighthouse. This is off of New Jersey, kind of the southern entrance to New York Harbor. The national parks, I think, as I recall, got this structure. When they were doing research on the building and starting to kind of probe around the basement and such, they discovered a secret room that had been boarded up, and they broke through it, and they found inside a small room with a table and a chair and a skeleton sitting at the table. So there was some kind of foul play at this lighthouse, and this is how some of these ghost stories get started, of course, at some of these lighthouses. So nobody really knows what happened there, but it wasn't good. Here's a lighthouse down in the Virginia Beach area. This is one of the older lighthouses in the south. But the old one, you can see the difference in the two structures, was replaced by the taller structure with the black and white panels down there in Virginia Beach. Here's Seguin Lighthouse in Maine. We were actually there for the decommissioning of this lighthouse, and they took the flag down for the last time as they vacated it and automated this lighthouse. This had a first order lens at the top. It was huge, about 12 feet tall. You could actually stand up inside of it. It weighed several tons, but you could move it with your pinky finger because it floated on a bed of mercury, and it would rotate that way. And it was just magical to be inside there because it's all prisms. And there's like rainbows casting out all around the room and everything. It's just a beautiful work of art, really, and beautiful technology that was developed in the 1800s by a Frenchman, a French physicist named Fresnel over in Paris. And of course, it was great to be able to talk and interview some of the last keepers. This is the Andy Gurman and his two daughters waiting for the flying Santa Claus at Owl's Head Light up in Maine, near Rockland. And somebody asked about Cape Nettic-Nubble, and this is how it used to look like when the keepers were there. And of course, when the keepers were at these locations, they were pristine, and they used to have white glove inspections by supervisors that would come and have surprise visits. So everything really had to be spick and span, and not even the dustpan, the brass dustpans that they used to have could have any dust on it. It had to be nice and clean, white glove inspections. So that was the problem, though. Once they took the personnel out of these sites, they went downhill very quickly. And a lot of it was just simply they were afraid of vandalism, so they just boarded these buildings up so tight they couldn't breathe. And that's when you saw, they started to, it's a highly moisture-laden area, obviously. And so all this moisture was being trapped in these buildings and just destroying them from the inside out. And that's caused a lot of concern for me. And that's why we started making some changes and started talking to Congress about it. Here's another family at Portland Headlight, just closing up. And it was a kind of an idyllic location. We saw some of the more difficult locations offshore. Some of them, like this, would have been, really a choice assignment to be in the city area and have a beautiful structure like this where you could raise a family and such in the old days. A lot of the families that lived at the lighthouses, like in the 1800s and such, they had dogs and all, and one of them was quite famous off of Lynn, Massachusetts, the Egg Rock Lighthouse, which is no longer there. But they had a famous dog in the 1800s during the Victorian era. It was kind of like the Rin Tin Tin or the Lassie of this last century. And this dog was called Milo. It was a Newfoundland, and they're great swimmers. And they taught this dog how to save people's lives. And he saved a number of people's lives, including this child's. And this was a picture that was done. You can still find this. It was a very popular image in the 1800s. You can still find this image at some antique dealers and such. But he used to fetch the mail. He used to, when they shot ducks, he would go fetch the duck, for dinner for the keeper and such. But he also, would fetch the mail from the mailboat, but also fetch people. Also, I actually ended up, I met the descendants of this family that lived out there. And Milo had puppies, and they had, and the dog taught its puppies how to save lives as well. And the lady was telling me that, when she was young, their dog, it was so embarrassing because he'd swim out to her and start pulling on her swimsuit. So, it was embarrassing. So he was a little too good at it, I think. But, so, at any rate, but these dogs were amazing, and a lot of, even to this day, up until fairly recently, dogs that could swim well, like Black Labs, which are descendants, as I understand it, of Newfoundlands. And dogs like this were held as major prizes at a lot of these lighthouses where people live. And you can see the beautiful architecture of the inside of some of these towers, the spiral staircase. There was a lot of beautiful handiwork that our forefathers put into these buildings. This is a smaller Fresnel lens, but you can see all the prisms that are bent basically to magnify the light into that center area. And they basically, Fresnel, what he discovered was that if you surrounded a light source with prisms, it bent the light into a center area. It would concentrate the light and actually magnify the candle power many times over. It become a mighty beacon, whereas it was just a relatively insignificant light source to begin with. So it was a great achievement in optics. And you can see this is opened up, just one light bulb, but that's the interior of a Fresnel lens. And look at the beautiful craftsmanship. This is the Portland breakwater light up in Maine. Just our forefathers put a lot of hard work into creating these structures. It's a beautiful building. Some of them were offshore, and of course very dangerous to build. This is off the coast of Louisiana. And these are screw-pile type lights that they would take a horse out on a platform and have these poles with screws on the end of them, large screws, and it'd have the horse basically go round and around and screw these pipes into the sandy bottom, and then they build on top of that to create the structure. Another form of lighthouse was the lightships, and of course the Nantucket lightship was probably one of the most famous. And I was there for the decommissioning of this lighthouse. I actually talked to some of the guys that were stationed on this boat. They actually did a foghorn blast for the last time when we had the ceremony there with the Coast Guard, and your whole body shook. And I can't even imagine living on that and having to put up with that on a regular basis. It just shook you right to the bone. It was a deep, very deep, resonant sound. And I talked to some of these guys. Of course, a lot of these kids, they're basically kids just out of high school that were on some of these locations. One of the things they used to do for fun was they would have 50-foot waves coming in sometimes at these light ships. Yeah. And they would time it so that they could run out and stand on the top of the pilot house there and watch the inside curl come over them, basically. And it was scary. I can't even believe what they must have done, or what it was like to live on something like that during a major storm or hurricane. Those obviously were very dangerous too for their personnel, so they were replaced by these large navigational buoys. This is in Gloucester Harbor getting repairs. But you know, it measures everything. It measures wave height, temperature, wind speeds, and you don't need to endanger your personnel in the Coast Guard. Here's an early colonial lighthouse down in New London. It's a beautiful structure, made out of stone. The twin lights at Thatcher Island, we actually ended up getting federal money for the North Tower to get that restored with the help of Senator Kennedy at that time. And this is an unusual structure down in New London, Connecticut. Really, it's a mansard roof and everything. Unusual architecture. Looks like something they took from downtown and just plunked that out in the middle of the water. But fascinating architecture for some of these lighthouses. Here's Art Deco design of Cleveland East Ledgelight down in Cape Cod and Buzzards Bay area. And of course, these lighthouses are very popular with artists and photographers and such as the photography class. Kind of good point light up in Maine. Some fishermen in front of the lighthouse in Newport, Castle Island. And here's your Cape Kinetic Nubble light again with a couple looking on a foggy evening. Marblehead Lighthouse with 4th of July with flares going on. Very popular. And then getting away from the coast a little bit, you have lighthouses even in Vermont. So here's one on Lake Champlain, Memorial Lighthouse. And another one at the Shelburne Museum, it's been moved there, which was out on Lake Champlain. And then there are lighthouses on the Great Lakes. Let's move this a little bit so you can see it. But that's one of the most spectacular lighthouses on the Great Lakes. That's the Split Rock Light up in Minnesota. And a Michigan State of Michigan National State Park has taken over this Osable Lighthouse along the Lake Michigan area. Here's a lighthouse. It's actually a pierhead type light out on the end of a man-made pier, but it's very popular. Summertime in Petoskey, Michigan. Kids jumping off into the water. Here's a kind of a Scottish castle style up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. This couple runs it as a B&B, so you can actually stay overnight with this place. So one of the things that's helping these lighthouses to find good alternative reuses, adaptive reuses for these buildings, to find ways to support it and bring in some money. This is the Youth Hostels program that uses this lighthouse. Tibbetts Point Light on Lake Ontario. You can stay overnight pretty cheaply, actually. But there are actually even lighthouses, if you will, on the rivers, on the interior of America. This is in New Orleans, on the Mississippi River, this skeletal structure. And in the old days, they used to hire farmers to light lanterns at bends of the river. And they had what kind of looked like railroad crossing signs, and they would hang a lantern there as a marker at night so that riverboats wouldn't end up grounded on turns in the river and such. Here's a lighthouse that's no longer with us. This is down in Galveston. This went down in one of the hurricanes. Sabine Pass has been restored. This is kind of on the Louisiana-Texas border. This burned down in a swamp fire. It's all swamp out here. I was a little concerned going out here with the Coast Guard. It's been a lot of alligators and snakes and stuff. But look at the flying buttresses for this building. Very interesting. And this has been restored now. So, and they got some of the funding that we got passed through Congress with the Lighthouse Bicentennial Fund. Sabine, this is Sanibel down in Florida. Probably some of you know about this beautiful area, good for finding seashells. And you notice the open construction there for hurricanes, the high winds. That's important for some of these lights to be kind of not offer too much resistance to the high winds. This is Cape Canaveral, about ready to be launched off here to the moon. But no, this is a lighthouse on the grounds of Cape Canaveral where they do launch spaceships. This is Rose Island. I think Marcia was asking about places you can stay. This place has been totally restored. It's a Victorian, and you can actually stay overnight and play lighthouse keeper. And you can do some of the chores and such that the lighthouse keepers used to have to do. It was a fun experience. We were able to work with Harvard Kennedy School through my colleague and neighbor. She put together some programs working with the Coast Guard to develop new language for lighthouse leases and licensing. And this is Watch Hill Light, and we helped to institute a new type of license or leasing arrangement for the community to take this over from the Coast Guard and have a museum there. Similar situation down at Beavertail Light in Jamestown, Rhode Island. It's been turned into a museum. This is the Three Sisters of Nauset on Cape Cod, here on Nauset Beach. These buildings were in deplorable condition. There were three of them, and that's why they called them Three Sisters of Nauset. But we were able to get them fixed up with the federal money we got passed through Congress. It was one of the 160 projects that got restored, and now it's part of a national parks site that you can visit. One of the early lighthouse project overnight stay situations we got started was at Isle of Ho up in Acadia National Park area. And I had, in my travels in my motorhome, I'd stopped on a stormy night. I'd been photographing the Pemmican Light, and I stopped at this B&B, and I asked if I could hook up, because it was stormy out, and if I could use their electric, and I paid them for breakfast in the morning. They agreed to that, and next morning I was surprised to find out they're from my home state of Ohio. Went to Ohio State and had met there and married and started the B&B. But she was the daughter of a lighthouse keeper. And they told me, if you can ever find a lighthouse that would make a good B&B, we'd jump on it. And just a few months later, I got a call from a family up in Idaho, the Greenlaw family. You might know the name Linda Greenlaw, who is the woman that, she's got a television program up in Maine now, but she was the woman in The Perfect Storm, the young sister ship. And she's written several books now herself. But her family owned this. And they wanted, because the family had grown over the years, it had been sold in the 30s during the Depression when the government needed money. And there's so many family members now, they couldn't really split it up equitably. So they wanted to sell it. So I went over there with Jeff and the people that I met at the inn, and we discovered that it was a perfect timepiece from the 1930s. There was like a hand pump at the sink. There was no electricity, no telephone service. It was operated with, heated by a Franklin stove. And so it was just a perfect little time capsule. And, but we couldn't afford it. We were just getting started, and he didn't have the ready cash. So he was kind of depressed after we had the meeting and stuff, and one of his customers there at his inn noticed how kind of depressed he was, and he said, "What's the problem?" He told him, "Well, we found this wonderful lighthouse. We'd like to make it into an inn, but we just don't have the money." He said, "Well, I'm checking out now." Well, this guy was kind of a crazy guy. He had been a Wall Street executive, but he blew his mind on drugs. He ended up getting divorced, and would hang out at his inn for a month or more and meditate up in their tree up in the front yard. And so he was kind of an embarrassment to him. He said, but you know, anyhow, he said, "I'm sorry to hear about that." He said, "Here's your check, you know, for my time." And Jeff didn't really think about it too much, but later on the day he picked up the check for $350,000 to buy this lighthouse.
Oh my goodness.
And a couple weeks later, that guy got in this rowboat, rowed out to the ocean during a storm, and never found him. So, at any rate, kind of an interesting story how this came to pass. And it became a very popular B&B for lighthouse lovers. Some of these buildings were really destroyed by, you know, vandals and such. This is Monomoy Point Lighthouse on Cape Cod, but we were able to get this restored with the help of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Department that actually owned it. And we were able to get money with Senator Kennedy's help to get this restored. And we were able to get lighthouse lenses for lighthouses where they had taken them out and got them replaced at some locations. This is the Aransas Pass Lighthouse in Texas, and it's owned by a millionaire, but he was looking for a lens, and we actually found a historic lens, and were able to link that up with him, and they relit it. The community had a big fireworks display and everything when the lighthouse got relit. A lot of the pictures that I ended up taking, I ended up submitting to the U.S. Postal Service. And actually had a contact to National Geographic. He was the art director was actually on the Citizens Advisory Committee for the U.S. Postal Service. He saw my pictures and stuff, and he said, "I think we should do Lighthouse series stamps." And many of these were. It was one of the old. I think it may actually be the longest-lasting series. It went over 36 years. They issued 5 stamps every few years, and a number of them were based on my photographs. Especially this one was a literal picture taken by me, and then illustrated by Howard Koslow, famous New York City illustrator. We ended up working with Senator George Mitchell and getting the passage of the Lighthouse Act through Congress, and especially we basically spent months bringing all the groups together in Washington, D.C., and that had interest in lighthouses. And with the help of my colleague, Dr. Nelson, we were able to come up with some good policies for the Coast Guard, for the federal government to implement. It became the Lighthouse Preservation Act of 2000, and that's the whole program now that has allowed these lighthouses to be turned over to community groups and had them rescued, basically, by people who cared about them, usually local groups. And it's been a win-win situation. The Coast Guard got out from under the weight of having to do maintenance on these buildings and historic preservation, which they had no mission for. And it allowed people that really cared about them to take them over. And the Coast Guard could still keep the buildings lit, the towers, but the community could enjoy it and take over the structures and take care of it. It's been a very popular program. For the Lighthouse Bicentennial in 1989, I was asked to put together an exhibit at the rotundas of the Senate and House, and I worked with the Coast Guard to bring Fresnel lenses and other artifacts from the lighthouses, and then did pictures and posters and such, as well to illustrate the lights at Congress, and also at the National Archives. And then the second set of stamps that came out was the Great Lakes stamps, which I'm a Great Lakes boy. I'm from Ohio originally. And this was the ceremony for the U.S. Postal Service with the unveiling of the Great Lakes lights. And then locally, we had help from the Bank of New England, who had a lighthouse logo, and we restored the 10-Pound Island Lighthouse in Gloucester Harbor, and got that relit. And then locally here, we, as Marcia mentioned earlier, we started a dining program. These at the Newburyport Rear Range Light, and you can actually dine at the top of the lighthouse, and it's been called by Yankee Magazine one of the top 35 things to do in New England, and the Phantom Gourmet has named it the most romantic and exclusive dining in New England. So it's a lot of fun. It's a one-of-a-kind. We don't know anywhere else in the world where you could dine at the top of a lighthouse tower. So we designed it as kind of a pilot project to show what could be done with an abandoned tower. And so as we kind of end up the program here, this is Thatcher Island. We'll kind of fade off into the sunset. This is Cape Dedic, Novel Light, one of my favorites, locally. That's pretty much it.
Awesome. There.